quorum.
All right, great.
When you're ready to call the meeting to order, and I'll start sharing the screen.
Okay, well, let's call our meeting to order. Welcome everyone for attending this meeting this morning. And we have an absolutely fabulous agenda full of great information. So we want to get started right now with roll call.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Member Anaya?
Here.
Member Arton? Member Chavez-Peterson? Member Kate Clark? Member Cinnamon Clark, I see your hand raised. Member Cinnamon Clark, if you could respond.
Clark here.
Thank you. Member De Los Rios?
Here.
Member Desert? Thought I saw Member Desert.
Here. Sorry, Claudia. Here.
No worries. Member Member Fowler?
Present.
Member Gillies? Member Gore via his designation, Nadia Mosharian Bindrup?
Present.
Member Griffin Jones?
Present.
Member Hassan?
Present.
Member Corey?
Present.
Member Murray Ramirez?
Present.
Member Nash?
Present.
Member Perez?
Present.
Member Ryman or Riemann? Is that Member Riemann? Member Tim Ryman? Member Gwen Sanders? Member Stefan?
Present.
And Member Choi?
Present.
That concludes roll call. And we do have one speaker on non-agenda comment this morning.
Please mute your speaker, please. Thank you.
Oh, Member Chavez-Peterson, I see your hand raised. You've joined us. Member Chavez-Peterson, did I catch you right? Okay,
Yeah.
and Member Kate Clark, are you present now? You're here?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Member Gillies, we see your hand. Can you affirmatively state your presence? Member Gillies, did I see you on?
I am here. Not sure.
Is she having audio issues? Okay. Once you're able to affirmatively state, we do have you marked. Madam Chair, we do have one public speaker on a non-agenda item. Non-agenda comment is limited to up to 2 minutes. No action can be taken on this item, but if it is a matter that the Commission wishes to discuss by placing on a future, discuss it and place it on a future agenda, they're able to do so. And that is Dave Myers. If we can, Denise, if we can unmute Mr. Myers, is he there as an attendee?
I don't see Mr. Myers listed as an attendee. There is a call-in number ending in 022, so I can check. Maybe that's the number he's using for this.
If you can do that.
Okay, so phone number ending in 022, you are unmuted. You are able to speak. I'm not sure if it's Dave Myers. I don't see his listed number as the attendee at this point.
Okay. And it looks like Member Arton is also in the attendee slot. I'm not able to see them all from mine. We're not getting any confirmation by that phone number ending 02 that is Mr. Myers. So, and I do see Member Arton is also present. Madam Chair, if the public speaker joins at a later time, we will keep you informed.
Okay.
Okay.
So
As we didn't have any, I'm sorry.
We're going to go to agenda item 5.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to introduce our new commission member. Tim Ryman was recently appointed by the Board of Supervisors by D2. I thought I may have heard him in the background, but I couldn't confirm it. Member Ryman, are you with us today? Looks like Mr. Ryman is not on in the meeting, so we'll pull this over, continue it to the next agenda.
Okay.
Madam Chair, the next agenda item is a community awareness briefing, which is a public health approach to targeted violence and terrorism prevention. With us today, we have Michael Brown, who's the Associate Director for Field Operations of the West for the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Office of Strategy, Policy and Plans from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. We also have Cindy Cipriani, the Senior Management Counsel and Director of Outreach and Engagement with the Office of the U.S. Attorney with the Southern District of California. I'd like to do a brief do their bios for the commission while we have Mr. Brown start sharing his screen. Michael Brown helps localities establish and expand local prevention frameworks that prevent individuals from radicalizing to violence through technical, financial, and educational assistance. He has worked in prevention since 2016 with the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention and its predecessor organizations and the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, managing cross-functional initiatives to inform and advance policy, strategy, research, and program activities and process. Prior to settling into his current role in Southern California, he led the onboarding and education of the regional prevention coordinators across the United States as the acting deputy director for field operations and formerly served as the office's associate director for policy and research. Michael joined the Department of Homeland Security in 2007 and has served in several collaborative roles with industry, interagency, international intelligence, and law enforcement partners as a research fellow at the RAND Corporation, branch chief for the Air Domain Intelligence Integration and Analysis Center pilot, Transportation Security Administration representative, and dual hat attaché for DHS at the U.S. Embassy Singapore, liaison officer, regional desk officer, inspector, and analyst. Before joining the federal government, Michael worked in the consulting industry as well as state and city government and began his professional career as a financial management officer with the MBNA America Bank. He's a native of Delran, New Jersey. He resides in California with his wife and 3 daughters and is a passionate fan of the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. We also have with us today Cindy Cipriani, who's a Assistant U.S. Attorney, and she develops partnerships and programs that further the U.S. Department of Justice's mission to prevent crime and enforce federal laws. She co-chairs San Diego's Multidisciplinary Opioid Coalition, which works across sectors to raise public awareness and end the vicious cycle of addiction and overdose death. Ms. Cipriani also leads the Juvenile Smuggling Prevention Team, a collaboration that Attorney General William Barr selected in 2019's Outstanding Contribution to Community Partnerships for Public Safety. In addition, she has organized numerous events and efforts to address targeted violence and hate incidences, earning ADL's Sherwood Prize for Community Engagement Work Combating Hate. Ms. Cipriani obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism at The Ohio State University and held staff positions in the Ohio Legislature and the U.S. House of Representatives. She received her law degree from Georgetown Law Center and litigated for nearly a decade at Gray Carey Wine Friedenreich, which is now DLA Piper, before becoming an assistant U.S. attorney in 1999. Ms. Cipriani has since held several senior management positions, including Deputy Chief of the Civil Division, Executive Assistant U.S. Attorney, and First Assistant U.S. Attorney. With that, I'll turn this over to Michael Brown and Cindy Cipriani to go through the slides. And this is their big launch on their public health approach. It's about an hour and a half total presentation, and I believe they have allocated time at the end for questions. Michael and Cindy, the floor is yours. And if you could just go ahead and do the full slideshow screen so everyone can see that.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I want to thank you for arranging this and also thank the members of the Human Relations Commission. I know many of you from work on the Hate Crimes Coalition and the Gang Commission as well. And it's a pleasure to be appearing before you today to just give you an overview of the framework that we're trying to achieve here in San Diego to keep all of us safe. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michael Brown from DHS, who will be leading our discussion.
Thanks, Cindy. What a pleasure it is to be here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Claudia, and really an honor to be here before you with this commission honoring the city's first African-American councilman. I recognize that there are several advocates in this call supporting youth and civil rights, humanitarian efforts, immigration issues, supporting the religious community, fair hiring, and a number of different equities, which all really play a part in prevention. So thanks for the chance to be here. I work for the Department of Homeland Security, and I recognize that comes with some level of context to most Americans right now, but I wanted to open by sharing very briefly just our Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And we're out to do what our mission says there, and that's to stop violence before it occurs. It's very personal to me. I lost my father in a terrorist attack several years ago by a domestic terrorist group, but not here in the United States, here over in Spain. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. A bus of civil guard was on a drive one day doing a changing of the guard at an embassy in Madrid, and he was on a morning jog. And while not the target of the attack, there was a bus of 16 law enforcement officers on a bus that day. I mentioned that to you for two reasons. One, to let you know about the people of the Department of Homeland Security. There's interesting folks with a diverse set of backgrounds that join this public service work to really advance the mission in a lot of different ways. I'm also mentioning it to let you know as we go through a couple of different types of topics today. We're going to briefly cover some emergent threats, some topics. The main focus of our work today is to talk about prevention. But when we talk about threats, sometimes folks tend to focus on which threats. I individually, Michael speaking, kind of don't care. We just want to stop the violence before it occurs. And that's kind of the lens through which we're going through this today. So thanks for your understanding as we go through that. As far as our Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, I recognize this is a very busy slide. Our office focuses on the well before focus on a timeline. We're looking to build partnerships and trust. We're looking to increase awareness of the threat and really the factors that folks could address to mitigate a potential concern, and also supporting the development of intervention programs. What we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the ability of bystanders to refer those for intervention and really get help for those who need it. And sometimes the perception is that it's, if you're working with the Department of Homeland Security, it's a law enforcement focus. We are seeking to build the capacity of local service providers, like many of the folks on this call and the organizations they work with, to handle these interventions on their own. And that model is very flexible, and it's a real treat to work with a colleague like Cindy Cipriani with the Justice Department located in San Diego to identify what resources can be part of a broader collaborative. So the reason this slide, when it mentions those, you see those red lines in the middle there, those dotted lines as far as disruption and investigation, that's not the space where I work. I work in that upstream prevention, awareness, and education as part of the broader local prevention framework, which I'll discuss more in a bit. Very briefly, I'm located in Southern California. I'm one of 11 folks around the country in this type of role. I know, there's bigger agencies within the Department of Homeland Security that we're all familiar with. We're a very small organization at this time, based in Southern California. And what we're here to do today is really to go over a couple different learning objectives as you embark upon your strategic planning efforts, as we're aware that you're speaking to a number of different organizations around the community. What we're trying to do is we're trying to discuss what the targeted violence and terrorism threat is in the United States, understand what puts people at risk of targeted violence and terrorism and how to prevent it. We'll get into the topics of risk factors and protective factors. What behavioral indicators do I look for and how do I help? And what the Department of Homeland Security and Justice Department are doing to help American society prevent the violence. And more specifically, what prevention programs can I be involved with? And maybe what prevention programs can support this broader model as well. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity, and pardon me for looking at my notes as I go through these notes today. A lot of this content is very new. In fact, you're one of the first organizations in the country that's even getting this briefing today. Because while the community awareness briefing, the CAB as it's well known, for the last decade has gone through a significant revamp, we're really taking a public health model approach to violence prevention. There's an extensive literature history of literature in violence prevention, and we're drawing on this multidisciplinary approach to really move the ball forward. Actually, we could say backward. We can say move it backward in a prevention mindset, because we don't want to be handling events after they happen. We want to be addressing getting help for those who need it long before it happens. This is more than traditional security work. This is not guns, gates, guards security. This is talking about social service programming and advancing the ability of organizations to have the capacity to handle these interventions on their own. Public health draws from multiple sectors, as you can see on the slide there: health, education, social services, justice, and the private sector. And this public health approach can also address other forms of violence as well, not just terrorism and targeted violence, but also suicide, intimate partner violence, child abuse, and other issues that might be sadly more endemic in our society. The public health model itself, it can be kind of summed up in this photo, and it's a diagram we got from some friends in the state of Colorado. And looking at this picture, one way to see it is how to develop strategies of prevention. And it's really a multi-layered approach to show how threats can change depending on where somebody is. If somebody's on the top of that cliff, that fence provides early prevention. If somebody's walking up the steps, there might be policies in place to support prevention. If measures in place are not working, hopefully there are safety nets in place, as you can see with the net there, for somebody that could be on the pathway to violence, but maybe is protected from an injury or injuring others. And then sadly, if somebody does happen to go down a path, how do we get treatment for somebody who needs it? Findings from research are very useful for developing prevention strategies. All of these elements form what's called a comprehensive local prevention framework. Once prevention strategies are developed or existing strategies are identified, they're then evaluated rigorously to determine their effectiveness. Right now, our field in targeted violence and terrorism prevention is relatively new, and there's many types of programs and activities that are designed to prevent and act. But right now, we're evaluating many for their effectiveness. But it doesn't mean we don't continue to tweak our strategies as we go forward. This is a public health model, and there are different elements of a public health model approach to those in the field that do public health work. It's primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary elements of prevention. We'll get into more of that later throughout the presentation, but we're really taking a lot of good information from the CDC and our health partners to really inform our work. Cindy, over to you. I think you're on mute, Cindy.
Our goal today is to give you an overview, not of every specific targeted violence incident or all of the domestic terrorism threats, but a general framework for responding to those threats and some background on how those threats arise. I think it's helpful, and we're going to start with a few definitions. Next slide, Michael. So targeted violence, the definition of that refers to an intentional act against a specific target that's designed to intimidate, coerce a broader population, regardless of the motive. Terrorism refers to violence committed in the name of ideology to further a political or social agenda. I think we saw an example of that on January 6th. And in the United States, ideology, regardless of the cause it supports, is protected. Force or violence, however, on its behalf is not. All terrorism is targeted violence, but not all targeted violence is terrorism. Sometimes the ideology is really the result of a mental health issue and not an effort to persuade the public with regard to a specific motive or ideology. But it's important to be aware that the term violent extremism is often used interchangeably with terrorism. The term violent extremism is an important term because it specifically separates ideology, which may be extreme but is protected if it's merely your belief, from behavior, which is the use of violence to persuade others with regard to that ideology. Okay, next slide. So the basic context for everything we're doing in the prevention framework is that America does protect civil rights, does protect civil liberties, and that is a major consideration when we're developing our policies for prevention. The First Amendment prohibits the government from regulating, establishing a law that governs religion, the free exercise of religion, speech, the press, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So protests are legal. Holding an ideological belief, even if it's one that many consider odious, that is legal. Speech, even though it's extreme and sometimes hateful, is legal. But when you mobilize and take action towards violence, that is where we draw the line. And this can vary from state to state in terms of what constitutes mobilization. But it's just really important to recall and remember that how someone looks, their faith, their beliefs, their presence at a protest, that does not indicate that they are or will become violent, that they are a terrorist, or that they're likely to engage in targeted violence. So effective prevention programs cannot focus on beliefs or trying to change beliefs. They need to focus on ensuring that individuals do not come to believe that violence is necessary in order to achieve their goals. And that doesn't mean that we aren't going to take action as well with regard to speech in terms of discouraging speech, reporting hateful incidents that may not be unlawful. We definitely want to, as members of the Hate Crime Coalition know, be monitoring and assessing and tracking hate speech because they often do lead to hate incidents. But the idea of prevention is really to focus on indicators of violence and not indicators of speech or beliefs that we may consider odious. So the US Capitol. We thought about adding some photos here, but I think we all have the images embedded in our brains at this point. We've seen the photos, we've seen the videos. I think we all share, collective disappointment, dismay, and concern over what happened. That is a major focus of the Department of Justice on the prosecution end. I think looking at what happened at the US Capitol is important because it's important for us to understand all of the indicators that existed beforehand, all of the ways that folks were persuaded to engage in that behavior, and what prevention steps could have been taken beforehand by bystanders, by the community, by law enforcement in order to avoid that, and how can we better understand what happened there. And hundreds of people have been arrested. Those charges are currently being prosecuted in Washington, D.C. Of course, all the individuals arrested and charged with this attack are considered innocent until they're proven guilty. From their own statements and from information in charging documents, we know that some of those individuals who are charged may not necessarily be considered violent extremists, although they did potentially engage in illegal behavior. But we also know that many were, and there were multiple types of violent extremist ideologies present on January 6th in Washington, D.C. And we're going to just briefly discuss some of those motivations here. And when we do that, we're going to be using the term DVE for domestic violent extremism. And that refers to individuals based and operating primarily within the US or its territories. They're not getting direction or inspiration from a foreign terrorist group or other foreign power that are seeking to further political or social goals through unlawful acts of force or violence. The mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, use of strong rhetoric, generalized embrace of violent tactics does not constitute extremism, and that may be constitutionally protected. But when you're moving towards violence, when you're actually breaching the Capitol and stepping in to disrupt the activities of US lawmakers, and you're actually engaging in violence against law enforcement, hunting down certain lawmakers, disrupting activities, that becomes something that's actionable under the law. Many of the people who were there that day could fit within one or multiple different categories of ideological motivation that can span a broad range of groups and movements. Throughout 2020, we've seen that the DVE threat was characterized by a number of broad categories: violent anti-government or anti-authority narratives, periods of prolonged civil unrest, conspiracy theories were active on January 6th. And what we saw was DVEs were primarily targeting law enforcement, symbols of government, but they also targeted individuals with opposing views engaged in nonviolent protest activity, as we saw with the BLM protest movement.
January 6th incident was comprised of many individuals, and here are two of the categorized ideologies as seen then. The first one listed there are racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who use threat or force to derived from bias, often related to race or ethnicity. More specifically, within that category are violent white supremacists. I recognize that this group has already heard from the Anti-Defamation League, but simply put, these are groups or individuals who facilitate or engage in acts of unlawful violence with the intent to intimidate or coerce the federal government, ethnic or racial minorities, or non-Christian faiths, and often specifically Jewish persons in support of their belief in the inferiority of non-white and non-Christians. Among DVEs, as Cindy said, domestic violent extremists, white supremacist extremists are the most persistent and lethal threat. In 2018 and 2019, white supremacist extremists conducted half of all lethal attacks and caused about 81% of deaths from those lethal attacks. The most lethal of those involved active shooter incidents in public locations or houses of worship using semi-automatic weapons. The next group that's listed on there, or the next section of groups, is the anti-government, anti-authority segment of violent extremists. These folks derive their sentiment from anti-government or anti-authority perspectives, including opposition to perceived or real negligence, legitimacy, government overreach, economic, social, or racial hierarchies, the mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, or generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute extremism, and it may be constitutionally protected, but once they turn into violence, obviously that's not constitutionally protected. Within the anti-government and anti-authority violent extremist categories, you've heard about movements including Boogaloo, which is referencing an uprising or impending civil war, or militia violent extremists who believe that the government is deliberately stripping Americans of their freedoms and is attempting to establish a totalitarian regime. Other folks involved in the January 6th event were radicalized to violence by non-traditional ideologies as well, conspiracies, one specific belief. And there's no evidence to support them, but it's helpful to understand what they are. QAnon is a collection of various conspiracy theories which began as a belief that the former president was secretly fighting a war against elite, Satan-worshiping pedophiles inside government. And since then, they've morphed and adopted multiple, sometimes contradictory conspiracy theories and has grown in terms of their adherents. Another conspiracy is the big lie, and I use that term in quotes, which began quickly after the November 2020 election. And it holds that the former president actually won the election, but was denied being sworn in as part of massive institutional and voter fraud. Again, there's no evidence to support these, but they both persist, and some were motivated by these beliefs. Some people had specific grievances surrounding the election, including that it was stolen, that the government is too powerful, there's an erosion of individual freedoms, other government conspiracies surrounding the coronavirus, as well as immigration and presence of minority populations, and concerns about federal encroachment on public lands. These grievances continue to persist, but when walking through this, we're able to answer the who, what, when, and why of the event. Other categories of domestic violent extremism are listed here in the green, blue, and dark blue segments of the slide. These tend to be less persistent, but still relevant of noting. Animal rights and environmental violent extremists are those that are seeking to end the perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals, as well as the environmental resources available. And also, not to be missed, is the abortion-related violent extremism, which we've seen attacks at Planned Parenthood clinics, as you can see on the upper left corner there. Other movements might include, other movements also include, of domestic violent extremists, also include anarchist violent extremists who further their opposition to all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions which they perceive as harmful to society. The picture on the bottom left there is from the burning of a federal building in Portland, Oregon, the Department of Homeland Security building, or the outskirts of a building there. The upper right corner is a domestic violent extremist threat that comes from the incel movement. And for those who are unfamiliar, individuals who engage in unlawful acts of violence believe that society denies them the sexual or romantic attention to which they're entitled. These incels, as they're called, which is a term that's short for involuntary celibate, is a community that's primarily online, but they blame social and political movements such as feminism and others for empowering others to deny them. Now, most incels don't to further their goals. And then the last category that's listed right there, domestic violent extremists, or sovereign citizen violent extremists. These are individuals who believe that the legitimacy of US citizenship should be rejected, and that almost all forms of established government authority and institutions are illegitimate, and that they are immune from federal, state, and local laws. This is from a traffic stop, I believe in Arkansas, where an individual was arguing with law enforcement, delegitimizing the role of law enforcement in that community. When we've given these community awareness briefings in the past, sometimes we walk through case studies. I've only highlighted one for us to talk through today, as we'd be here for several hours, as one case study could take days to even walk through. But I'm walking this through with you because the slides after this presentation will get into our whole of society approach and the public health approach that I was talking about earlier. But here are some details about an individual back in 2018 named Scott Paul Byerly. And in November of 2018, Scott Byerly entered a yoga studio in Florida, and he shot 6 women, killing 2. I'm bringing this to our attention in light of recent uncompleted investigation of what happened in Atlanta, Georgia, but it certainly was a case study that came to mind following that terrible attack just last month. Scott Byerly self-identified as an involuntary celibate and posted multiple videos suggesting sympathies with white supremacist ideology. One of the categories I had listed on the slide was the other category. And what we're starting to find, in fact, the FBI director just mentioned that there's a, I believe the term is a salad bar ideology, where individuals are picking ideologies just to justify their own respective narratives. So this individual, as I said, self-identified as an incel. He posted videos sympathizing with white supremacist ideology, and there was evidence that he planned his attack several months in advance. He had a long history of inappropriate and criminal behavior directed towards women. Before his radicalization of violence, he had a long history of misogynistic attitudes and behaviors which were noticed by classmates, teachers, and others. However, they did not result in interventions. And again, the diversity of this Human Relations Commission is a great audience for this because we all come about this from different lenses. In high school, Byerly wrote a novel, Rejected Youth, about a protagonist who held a grudge against girls who believed shunned him and humiliated him. In that novel, the protagonist murders them and subsequently jumps off a roof before the police can stop him. A classmate of him noted that the names in his journal related to real classmates and was basically a high school journal. He was vice president of his high school class, running on a slogan of "Vote Byerly because we don't need no woman." In college in New York, he was banned from a downtown bar for groping women and fired from a job for harassing a female coworker. And he began writing music at the time, including a song based on the female coworker he harassed. His continued writings were a concern to his family, with his sister-in-law telling Tallahassee police that he was at home, that his parents would sleep with their bedroom door locked. At one point, his brother and sister-in-law considered contacting police in 2002 around the time of the DC sniper, thinking that he could be the person. In 2005, he worked for a high school in Maryland teaching English and social studies, and at the end of his first year, he was investigated by police for making inappropriate comments toward a female student. And while the case was suspended, he taught for another year before resigning. In 2008, he enlisted in the Army after completing officer school and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He was released in 2010 for unacceptable conduct, and the Tallahassee police reviewed his release and found that he was investigated, again, for inappropriate contact with females. He continued to document his episodes and his fantasies in his music and wrote more than 100 songs, recording more than 24 of them. He also maintained a website, posted some videos to YouTube. His writings were railing against women, liberals, homosexuals, and how the white race was being polluted. And in 2018, the FBI was tipped to his website, and after review, they took no further action as the content was still deemed as protected activity under the First Amendment. After being removed from the Army, he moved to Tallahassee to begin graduate school and wrote admirably of a serial killer, Ted Bundy, who lived at a boarding house there and actually attacked 4 women on Sorority Row on the grounds of that school. In 2011, he assigned roommates to him, reported unusual behavior, how he appeared friendless, how he made inappropriate comments. A year after that, he groped 3 women in an undergraduate dining hall one day and was arrested, but the victim who alerted police chose not to prosecute, and he was just banned from the dining hall. After 2 more incidents, he was banned from campus. Soon after, he completed his master's degree and started working as a substitute teacher in the Leon County school system, but was subsequently fired for viewing pornography at work. He tried pursuing a stand-up comedy career, but found that his anti-Semitic humor was not welcomed, and he joined a meetup group online where he earned the moniker of Nazi Scott. In 2016, he was charged with battery after he grabbed and shook a woman after she declined his offer to help her apply tanning lotion while she was sunbathing. And he was diverted to mandatory counseling for sex addiction, which he dismissed later as a racket. Byerly wrote online that he'd been ordered to counseling on at least 4 separate occasions dating back to high school related to females and his mania. In 2016, he moved to Florida, where he was hired as a substitute teacher, but fired within a year once again. And after being fired, he became more isolated. He then began Google searches for yoga studios, finally settling on one 250 miles from where he was living. So it wasn't even just directly in his community. So I'm going through the major details of this case study for folks to think about different entry points and, along his radicalization of violence process. He was a self-proclaimed incel. There were possible mental health issues as he was fired from jobs. He couldn't form meaningful relationships with women, and he was growing isolated, including from his family. And while he posted materials online, there was no clear evidence that he had any type of community support from like-minded individuals. So as far as opportunities to intervene, the questions that ask are: who evaluated him in his counseling? What were the responsibilities of the school officials? Who could have interacted with him more? And from a law enforcement perspective, with multiple contexts, would aware of this ideology have resulted in a different outcome? Again, this is just one individual who took violent action. And what it demonstrates through a long period of time is that opportunities for intervention are very critical. Right now, in this current climate, we're seeing several grievances as it relates to domestic terrorism, as you can see as the 9 boxes on the slide there. My mom used to have a line. She used to say, you have friends for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. Some of these grievances might be for a distinct reason. It might be a season, meaning that it's currently present, or they might be long-term and enduring things like anti-Semitism, racism, or grievances against immigration. But something like COVID-19 is that current season. Needless to say, all of these grievances may be persistent or seasonal or still emerging as we speak. As much as we're talking about domestic terrorism today, international terrorism still remains a concern. I won't read through this slide right here, but simply put, while much of the headlines as of late are centered on domestic terrorism, homegrown violent extremists who are inspired by or associated with foreign terrorist organizations are still looking to use violence. As you can see on the bottom of the slide there, it is quiet, generally speaking, from a violence perspective, that violent extremism and terrorism may have seemed in 2020. There were still 3 FTO, foreign terrorist organization, attacks in 2020 that targeted military and law enforcement personnel. And again, while I'm talking a lot about violent extremism and terrorism, targeted violence is critical to mention as well. The end all with targeted violence is that we've learned that the tools that can prevent terrorism and targeted violence are very similar for both. And by targeted violence, I'm talking about activities that involve acts dangerous to human life, that involve a degree of planning, a pre-identified target, including an individual based on actual or perceived identity traits, or property based on actual or perceived identity traits. Individuals that conduct acts of targeted violence are seeking to generate publicity for the perpetrator or their grievances. And it can take on many forms, whether it's attacks against houses of worship, school shootings, workplace shootings, and more recently, the terrible attacks against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community that we've seen here in San Diego, as well as across the country. Cindy?
So we've talked a little bit already about the difference between radicalization and mobilization. And it's really important to understand that distinction, because the focus of Michael's office and my prevention efforts is really on the radicalization aspect. That's where the prevention framework can make a difference. Once you move to mobilization, once that occurs, it's going to be in the law enforcement arena. So to the extent we can develop programs, a local framework, social services network to address radicalization before mobilization occurs, everybody benefits from that. It provides for a much healthier community. If you find people who are in the process of coming to that belief that threat or use of unlawful violence is necessary or maybe even justified in their mind to accomplish a goal, but they haven't actually mobilized to violence yet. And so there's not really a need for law enforcement intervention, but there's a huge need for community intervention. So if we develop a framework that basically fills the gaps that we're seeing now, when we're seeing some of the shootings now where there were warning signs, where there was some indication that that some help was necessary, redirection was necessary, or treatment was necessary, we can prevent mobilization, we can prevent incarceration, and we can prevent violence and horrible incidents from occurring. And I think so many of us in the prevention arena, we have a saying that we're not going to incarcerate our way out of this problem. And that's true with this issue as well. We can't incarcerate our way out of it, but we certainly can engage in prevention. We will take law enforcement action when needed, but we certainly can engage in, hopefully, prevention in a collective way, with everyone in the community participating and, having a voice and having avenues and resources that will avoid mobilization, avoid tragedy. And that's really the goal here. So next slide.
Thanks, Cindy. So this slide right here is really just a small sample of the factors at work. Simply put, we don't know what combination and at what level psychological and social factors are at work that would lead one person to engaging in an act of violence, and another person to advance a goal using pro-social and advocacy methods. What we do know is that no one is born a terrorist. No one is born with a destiny of carrying out an act of targeted violence. We do know that individuals have had a grievance. They had a perception that either themselves or a group that they identified with was being mistreated, that there were other people who knew and others encouraged extreme behavior that didn't dissuade it, and that they were generally in some emotional distress. And to be clear, when we talk about emotional distress, this could be a diagnosable mental illness, but not all the time. In fact, more transitory types of distress, like the loss of a relationship, can be descriptive enough to categorize that emotional distress. What's clear in most cases of targeted violence and terrorism is that the person changed from who they once were toward a violent act. And that behavioral change really sits at the center of this public health discussion. We'll talk more about that in a little bit.
So I'm going to briefly discuss QAnon. We could probably spend the entire hour and a half talking about QAnon. It's such a mystery to me. I don't know how many of you may have watched the HBO documentary about QAnon. And when you hear about what QAnon believes, and I'll just briefly describe that for those of you who may not be familiar. But QAnon is a disproven, discredited American far-right conspiracy theory that alleges that a secret cabal of Satan-worshiping, cannibalistic pedophiles was running a global child sex trafficking ring and plotted against former President Donald Trump when he was in office. There's more to it than that. There are several offshoots and other narratives that QAnon pushes. I think the biggest mystery for so many of us is, how do people, some of whom you may know and respect, come to believe this? How does that happen? And I read an article recently in Psychology Today that talks about the fact that QAnon is part conspiracy theory, part religious cult, part alternate reality role-playing game. And when you think about QAnon, it's important to consider the different facets that help understand why followers don't want to escape it, because doing so might mean giving up a form of recreation, a sense of belonging, or even a new identity and mission in life. And that's basically how folks get hooked. They find a way to identify with a broader group, to give life meaning, and having a sense of grievance. The idea that misery loves company gives you a sense of connectedness with other people who have the same grievance. And that's how something like QAnon takes off. And then you wonder also, when you hear people talking about the replacement theory, a white supremacist narrative, that if you allow immigrants to come into the country, you are being stamped out, you are being replaced. How do people come to buy into that? And when we say persuasive narratives, we should have a big question mark after that, because we don't find these narratives to be persuasive. But there are large groups of people who do. And what we're going to show next is a very, very short video that is found pervasively on the internet, and it does basically demonstrate the replacement theory. Cue that up, Michael.
Michael, for some reason, we're not hearing the audio this time. I know you did the run through and it worked.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. We'll try one more time. Let's go back to the start. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think I had it on mute. That's operator error. My apologies. We'll try it one more time.
Asia is for the Asians, but white countries are for everyone. Diversity is only eliminating white children. Eliminating a race, in whole or in part, by whatever means, is genocide under the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. Genocide is not only a heinous crime, but it is also morally wrong to support the destruction of any of the world's races. Diversity is just a code word for white genocide. There will still be 1 billion Africans in Africa, 1 billion Indians in India, and 2 billion Asians in Asia, because they are not being flooded with people of other races and forced to assimilate with them. Multiculturalism is just a code word for white genocide.
Thanks, Michael. Next slide. So that could be an example of malinformation that is used to spread these theories on the internet. And other ways we see the theory spread: disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. Sometimes the facts are true, but they're taken out of context and given a malicious overtone. Sometimes the facts are blatantly false. And I think we've seen, for example, with COVID-19, a lot of the false narratives that social media platforms have been incredibly aggressive about removing those from their platforms. When it came to misinformation, for example, and disinformation about the election, social media platforms started removing those after January 6th from their platforms. So we're seeing a little bit more, I think, self-regulation, maybe not enough self-regulation in terms of what social media is doing. Another way that these conspiracy theories and these narratives spread is through algorithms. And there's a really excellent podcast called The Rabbit Hole. It's part of the New York Times Daily that talks about the fact that, for example, the video we just saw, diversity is a code word for genocide, that somehow you're being subjected to genocide by allowing immigrants to come into your country. That is something that at one point, if you had liked that on YouTube, you would have been fed by YouTube 20, 30, 50 other videos that are similar in nature, to the point where essentially it's like a subtle brainwashing that takes place over time, where you're only being fed for confirmation bias purposes information that you've already expressed an interest in. Now YouTube is taking a different approach, and once you show interest in a white supremacy narrative, they're giving you automatically information on the other side to counter that narrative. And it's really fascinating to see what a difference that makes. But we're seeing through the spreading of the disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and the algorithms, that the difference between a responsible network that's at least trying to balance that content and networks that are and it's what's causing some of the issues that we're seeing out there in society today. It's creating a lot of mistrust in or a lack of official sources of information. And we're also seeing technology used to create deep fakes, where you actually see images and videos that are manipulated by software to substitute faces with incredibly convincing results. And we've also seen bots where disinformation is artificially generated, published online under the guise of being a human participant. So the technology, which is such a gift in so many ways to our society, that's allowed us to all stay connected during a pandemic, has also created a lot of issues and challenges that I think we are still wrestling with here today. Next slide. So when you think about the online environment, I'm curious to know, and maybe we can use chat for this and we'll report the chat, because I know it's a public meeting and you discourage use of chat, but if you could just put how many apps in there you personally use. I don't even recognize all the apps on this slide. I recognize most of them. And it kind of goes, it runs the gamut from less encrypted to more encrypted as you move from left to right. But if you feel comfortable doing so, feel free to comment and we'll just take a look at the chat and report back on how many of these different social media platforms folks are using.
So far, Cindy, I've seen somebody put too many. Somebody put 13.
Okay, 13 is the winner so far.
Yeah, 434.
So if we want more information about these various apps, we should have Tammy Gillies, who's the winner so far at 13, provide us a briefing at a future meeting. I mean, some of these are wonderful ways to connect and stay informed about friends, family, social events. For example, during the protests last summer, there was a group created in my neighborhood. I live in Scripps Ranch for Diversity and Inclusion. And I love that group. It's fantastic. And I think it created a true sense of community in Scripps Ranch. It was a Facebook group. And, more and more people were joining it. And it just, I think it became a touch point for so many of us in the community. And, they created signs. And so you felt like when you were walking your dog and you saw those signs that even if you didn't know that person, you had something in common with that person. You shared a common vision with that person. So all of these can be used for advancement of important ideas. And it's unfortunate that what we're seeing is that some of them are being used for just the opposite. And it is a true challenge for all of us in the community in the prevention space, and also for public policy leaders to ascertain just how to engage and what kinds of policies to develop to limit the harm that can be caused by this. Next slide.
So the next question, let me make sure. Am I on mute? No. Okay, good.
We hear you.
Thanks, Claudia. I appreciate it. The past year, I've been spending more time talking on mute than I had expected. So what we want to go forward with next is really talking about what puts people at risk of radicalization and violence and how do we prevent it. This gets into that health approach that we were talking about earlier. It's not enough to know the magnitude of a public health problem. We found out about that with the coronavirus this past year. It's important to understand what factors can protect people or put them at risk for experiencing or perpetrating an issue. So risk and protective factors can be very helpful. They help identify where prevention efforts need to be focused. And risk factors, just by being a risk factor, does not always mean that they cause violence. In fact, the presence of a risk factor doesn't even mean somebody will experience violence. As we want to be very clear, victims are never responsible for the harm inflicted upon them. So risk factors, as you can see right there, does not predict or cause targeted violence or terrorism. And a protective factor builds a buffer against risk. In fact, a lot of the work of the organizations that are members of the Human Relations Commission here are doing work in the protective factor space already.
So there's no demographic profile that really will establish when a risk factor can become a true danger. But, you know, I have a little bit of experience with this. I have somebody, for example, in my family who has mental illness. That can be a risk factor, but the protective factor is very, very supportive family members who ensure treatment, ensure compliance with treatment, and that can make a huge, huge, huge difference. And, you know, we've seen that there is a substantial increase or a substantial correlation, I would say, between mental illness and some of the violence that we've seen. However, there are so many people who suffer from mental illness who are not violent. And so it doesn't mean if you have that risk factor that is necessarily predictive. And it's very important because everyone reacts differently to difficult circumstances. So for example, somebody may lose their job, and that's a risk factor if they are, if there are different difficult economic constraints. It can create depression and a mental health overlay as well. Others might see that as a welcome change that pushes them to do something different. So you look at the risk factors, and people can react completely differently to them. And depending on their protective factors, the protective factors can be what prevents an individual with risk factors from getting into a danger zone. So really the presence of risk factors aren't predictive, but they do signal that someone might be experiencing stressors. And that can be a signal for prevention frameworks to take action to surround somebody with services to make sure that person is supported and that the risk factors are being addressed in a really healthy way.
Thanks, Cindy.
So next slide.
Sure, I was just going to add, and they can also obviously inform policy and strategy as this group is, which is why we're here today.
Yes, exactly. So these are just some of the risk factors: a history of criminal violence, having a criminal history, being involved with a gang or delinquent peers, having someone, a friend of yours, who is maybe a strong, staunch believer in terrorist narratives or has actually taken action, being a member of an extremist group for an extended period, having a deep commitment to a very extreme ideology, having psychological issues or being unemployed or having a sporadic work history. Those are all potential risk factors. Did you want to discuss those as well, Michael?
I was just going to add that, I know people with relationship challenges. I know people who are out of work. I know people who are distant from their family. Doesn't mean that somebody is going to be a terrorist or a violent extremist or carry out a violent act. These are not necessarily predictive. They're risk factors. And just want to I'll probably repeat that a couple times later down the line, but these are the types of issues that are addressed with good programming and good policy. As far as the difference or similarities, so the previous research, the page before, both of these pages are from the National Institute of Justice, and they did a study on risk factors and indicators. These were the risk factors for individuals based on case studies associated with terrorism. These are for those associated with targeted violence. The ones that are highlighted on this slide show similarities between violent extremism and targeted violence risk factors. The overlap suggests that this concept of local prevention frameworks that we're working on that address risk factors for one that address risk factors for terrorism will also address risk factors for targeted violence. We're keenly interested, most importantly though, in behavioral change. That's something I mentioned a little bit earlier. When you see a change in the behavior, that's the big deal. These were changes observable to others, and we'll get into more of this later, whether it's new and increased substance abuse, depression, self-isolation, somebody engaging in self-harm, quitting a job, changes in appearance. There may be many reasonable explanations for everything I just mentioned, all those changes. But the key is that if the changes were extreme enough to be noticeable, then that's where we get into the space of maybe finding help for those who could use it. The Secret Service found that 87% of targeted violence attackers experienced a risk factor within 5 years of their attack, and 81% experienced the risk factor within 1 year of their attack. Given the time lag between the attack and when that risk factor was experienced, really offers an opportunity for local prevention programming to stop somebody engaging in targeted violence by addressing the risk factor before the person even proceeds down a path toward violence. Now, on the other side of things, we talked about risk factors. Let's talk about protective factors. And protective factors, again, these are a bunch of programs that members of the Human Relations Commission are developing and enhancing just based on my research before the meeting. The great work that this group is doing is driving strong ties to the community, supporting the development of self-esteem, supporting the development of understanding of religion and ideology, bringing parents into an individual's life. Excuse me for 1 second. Sorry about that. Promoting diversity of options for nonviolent outlets to address grievances. All of these are protective factors that are very useful in building resilience against those risk factors that we were talking about for adults. For children, there's many more documented protective factors as well. This is a list that came to us from the CDC, and by developing these protective factors, we can support violence prevention efforts as well. Candidly, they provide cross-checks for me as a parent. I just moved to California this past summer from the East Coast, and my children are 16. I have 3 daughters. They're 16, 13, and 10, and we're here in the Southern California community, and I'm concerned about social isolation. I'm concerned about some of the challenges that they're facing right now without getting into the community, and having the challenges that we've all experienced over the past year, except for the fact that they're also just placed in a brand new community here. But you can see from the extensive list that's there, and I think my office is in the process of putting some products together that can deliver these that could be useful for eliciting program support within the San Diego community to help organizations recognize their role in violence prevention efforts. Now, I'm going to get a little more theoretical, but I'll try to be in a practical space here too, as we talk about the public health model for targeted violence and terrorism prevention. A local prevention framework, this concept I've been talking about, really works within the public health model that we have right here. There's multiple levels, and I'll work from the bottom up right here. At the primordial prevention level, we're talking about policy development. How do policies support targeted violence and terrorism prevention? So, for example, the federal government may work with tech providers to take down harmful content and stop the spread of images of violent attacks. There might be policies, and that happens more in the international space than it does in the domestic space because of free speech and free expression constitutional protections. State and local governments might have policies that prevent the occurrence of a risk factor. School districts might have policies to stop bullying behavior, which could lead to social isolation and alienation as well. Primordial prevention programming may not specifically target targeted violence and terrorism prevention, but when we saw the risk factors that we talked about, these are policies aimed at everybody. Okay, this is that whole of society policy approach aimed at everybody. Any programs that are explicitly aimed at groups of people based on perceived race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or other protected groups that violate simply those actions would violate basic tenets of civil rights and civil liberties, and they're counterproductive to targeted violence and terrorism prevention. We're aimed at addressing the risk factors with these policies, everybody. If we move up on the pyramid right there, you can see primary prevention. Primary prevention programs focus on addressing risk factors and building protective factors throughout the community. What we're doing today is primary prevention. That's empowering bystanders through an awareness briefing. And the briefing that Cindy and I are offering today stands available to be delivered to programs and community organizations that might seek benefit from this to help them recognize their role in empowering bystanders in addressing the risk factors. So that's primary prevention, that awareness piece, that's the big part. Secondary prevention, the next element up on the pyramid there, targets a subset of the population who might be considered a risk to radicalizing to violence. These programs are run by professionals. We're talking about threat assessment and threat management. These are individuals and organizations that respond to referrals from the bystanders. Right now, you're all empowered bystanders based on this discussion. The next phase is that individual assistance for someone who might need a threat assessment right away. Now, in some cases, there may be no risk at all, and the team decides that, you know what, we still have a program that could help somebody through the primary prevention efforts. But there's other cases where the risk might be high and the threat might be imminent, and the threat assessment team might make a direct referral to law enforcement. Essentially, these threat assessment and threat management teams work to understand the causes of noticeable behavioral change with the goal of off-ramping people from radicalizing to violence. So while the bottom two parts of the pyramid there are on focus on community efforts, the primary and primordial prevention, the secondary prevention is focused on individuals. Now, tertiary prevention are directed, on the top of the pyramid there, are directed at individuals who have planned to engage in acts of targeted violence or terrorism. These individuals may have been investigated or referred to by the FBI or law enforcement, or referred to Cindy's office at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Whether they're prosecutable or not, those individuals may be referred to specialized programs. And the goal of those programs is to prevent additional violence. This could be somebody that was investigated and then the charges are dropped, but then there's supporting programs that could be available to put somebody on the path of positive social outcomes. It could be for somebody who's done time in prison already, and when they get out of prison, they need prevention programming. If you remember that slide that we had with the 5 columns in the beginning, and I talked about the post-prison space, this could be helpful there as well, because prevention isn't something that ends at an attack. Obviously, if somebody does time in prison, they've gone through the correctional system, we want to make sure that they have the support and safety nets afterwards. These programs are designed to rehabilitate and prevent recidivism, to build positive pro-social connections with the community. So this is a big slide here because this is new material and new content. I'll pause on that one just for a moment because it's not content that we've spoken about within the Department of Homeland Security. We've spoken about it internally for several years, but it's not something we've rolled out to the public, but we plan to do so much more going forward. And that's why we were talking so much about risk factors and protective factors. Cindy, you want to talk about the role of bystanders in the space?
So if you haven't actually read the Secret Service report, the National Threat Assessment, I highly recommend it. You can find that report online, and it does a very deep dive into mass attacks in public spaces. They publish a report each year. And one of the aspects of this report that I find really interesting is they do an especially deep dive on every single indicator that people noticed beforehand. And they found that 2/3 of attackers did exhibit behaviors that elicited concern in other people and the people closest to them. And in over half of the attackers, those behaviors that they engaged in concerned others to the point that they actually did fear for the safety of themselves or others. So what one of our goals is here today, really one of our primary goals is in the primary prevention framework, is to empower those bystanders to come forward and provide services, to report if there's actual mobilization to law enforcement, but to come forward and report it in a way that will ensure that the potential threat is addressed and that the person's needs are addressed in a healthy way. And some of the behaviors that did elicit concern that are reported by the Secret Service, some of those behaviors are expressions of homicidal, suicidal ideations, domestic violence incidents, social media posts with concerning content, threatening statements toward others, weapon purchases, harassing or stalking behaviors, bizarre or incoherent behavior, non-compliance with mental health medication, signs of depression, increased isolation, acts of self-harm, poor school attendance, no longer paying bills. Those statistics are also found in an FBI study of 178 fully adjudicated cases of violent extremists in the US. So this is something where we're starting to see patterns. These kinds of indicators, if you don't engage in prevention, these kinds of indicators are much more likely to lead to violence and tragedy. So those are the kinds of things that we can all be on the lookout for. Now, who are bystanders and what can they do? Well, bystanders are people in a space where they're in a position to notice something that doesn't seem quite right. Friends, parents, siblings, other family members, coworkers, supervisors, romantic partners, classmates. In fact, Summer Stefan, our DA, just recently recognized in her Citizens of Courage event a classmate who reported another classmate who was threatening school violence. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. And that was somebody who was an empowered bystander who came forward and potentially helped to avert a tragedy. Neighbors, landlords, members of the community, even social media contacts, retail service employees, court personnel, mental health professionals, all of those different individuals are in a position to potentially be bystanders who can notice something and hopefully takes some sort of protective, supportive action.
So remember how I said that this was one of the first times this presentation is being given. I may have spoiled some of the future content by talking about it previously. So thanks for your kindness and understanding as if I sound a little duplicative right here, because we're going to talk about behavioral indicators, what to look for. So indicators are behavioral changes. That's the big takeaway. If somebody is doing abhorrent behavior, but they always do abhorrent behavior, but then they move to next level behavior, that's something that could flag some issue of concern. So when we talk about indicators, we're talking about characteristics that could be predictive, essentially. In targeted violence and terrorism prevention, these are generally observable behavioral changes that could be concerning to a person's friends, colleagues, or loved ones. Press reporting, right now, we just saw what happened at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis a couple of weeks ago. Public source reporting right now is sharing that the parent of the individual saw concerns before the attack was carried out. So the role of the bystander is so important, and just as important is the ability for a local prevention framework to have supportive programs to make sure acts of violence never take place. As far as examples of potential radicalization to violence indicators, you can see on the slide right here. Again, we're separating out the risk factors from indicators discussion, where a risk factor is a characteristic that increases the likelihood of a person becoming a victim or perpetrator. The indicator role is different. They're focused on signaling or broadcasting their intent to engage in violence. There's a term, it's a medical term, I believe, called leakage, where the individual feels comfortable enough with their decision that they no longer take precautions to even hide their intent. It's important that in most cases that a lot of these behaviors here are not even illegal. But if somebody has never experienced these behaviors before, they could be very well as concerning. So you can see it could be someone aware of someone's extremist ideology. They're broadcasting the intent. That's the leakage piece I just mentioned. Maybe they're stockpiling weapons. Maybe they're concealing or deleting or manipulating their social media in a different way. You're looking for the behavioral change. They used to be like this, but now they're like that. If you see these behaviors, you should act on what you've seen and be an empowered bystander. You can always prevent an attack by reporting concerning behavior to a trusted authority in your community. If an attack is imminent, you can always call 911. There are cases that don't manifest into an act of violence, but absolutely that is an option. And if you want to get help for somebody radicalizing to violence, you would want to connect them with the local violence prevention program, maybe mental health services. At the end of the presentation, Cindy and I will kind of initiate that call to action to say, who are the members of this local collaborative that should be part of this discussion? And thank you for some of your comments in the briefing. Unfortunately, I can't share the presentation at this time because it is still deliberative at this time as we're going through our content. To address the question on the bottom, and I'll just take it right now in the middle, is this part of DHS's Countering Violent Extremism program, CVE, for some of those folks that may be familiar with the space? It is, I would say it's a 2.0 version of that. I candidly say, as a member of the Department of Homeland Security for the last 13 years, and in this mission space for the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot of iterations of the program. We've taken a lot of feedback from community groups that had concerns with the program in the past, which has defined our move toward this public health approach. So I hope that is a big takeaway for those who might have seen some of the longer arc of history in this mission space. Going forward with the discussion on the examples of radicalization to targeted violence, radicalization of violence, these are some indicators that some themes that may have come out from targeted violence attacks, maybe not terrorism attacks, but targeted violence attacks. This was from a Secret Service report where somebody may have threatened another individual up front. Maybe they've made statements that was concerning up front, or a fixation in a way that negatively impacts their life, including a preoccupation with death or previous attacks. These are some salient themes that have come out. So if we look right here, this is just a notional case example. I would love if we were in person, and hopefully we do get to be in person at some point in the future. This case example is based on a real event. A high school student in a rural northern Colorado town was asked to write a memoir on his life for class. He made threats that he'll bring a gun to school and repeat prior attacks. He said his best birthday present was an AK-47 weapon. He mentioned that the happiest time in his life was 9/11, and the saddest time of his life was coming to the school where he was a student. He was showing drawings of swastikas and guns. He had an absent father, suffering from depression. Just a lot of stuff going on right here. And some of this, I just want to flag for you based on our dialogue today about risk factors and indicators. There are differences here, right? So I could poll the chat right here, but it might be easier just for me to kind of talk through. But feel free to participate in the chat. I do have it up and I'm trying to monitor the comments as we go. As you can see here, the indicator, a big indicator, is the threat that he's making, right? He says he'll bring a gun to school. But a risk factor could be that his father is absent, right? So if we talk about what could be predictive or what could be a behavioral change, that's the difference between risk factors and indicators. Suffering from depression, not necessarily an indicator. Depression is something experienced by many folks around the country, especially kids and students that are experiencing this home learning environment that we're in right now. So risk factors, indicators, these are some of the separations and identifications that we'd like you to think about as we go forward. As you can see on the bottom there, the principal did a threat assessment and a threat management plan with consultation from a threat assessment expert They determined that there was no access to weapons for this person, and the person is in ongoing counseling doing regular check-ins. So we might see alarming or concerning activity, but not everything manifests itself into a violent act. But this underlines the importance for threat assessment, which is a systemic approach to identify individuals who are exhibiting threatening or concerning behavior, identifying information, assessing whether or not they pose a harm, and then managing the risk afterwards as well. When we talk about threat assessment, any compilation of individuals and organizations can constitute a team. In fact, we encourage the development of multidisciplinary teams. This is not just a law enforcement function. Okay, you can see on the last bullet on this slide right here, any institution can create their own multidisciplinary team with the correct training to handle cases. Now, again, there are times that a law enforcement official should absolutely take the referral, but there are times that law enforcement has said, we don't know what to do with this individual. So that's why we're looking for this whole of society approach. This could include administrators at a school, social service providers, faith leaders, medical personnel, law enforcement, tech experts, mental health clinicians. That multidisciplinary team is very, very helpful, but law enforcement involvement is crucial, and we want to be as direct with that up front. That said, law enforcement does not have all the solutions, which is why this approach moving forward from a public health approach, emphasizing the value of awareness, is part of our discussion today. So we always get the question, who do I call? You know, oh my goodness, you just showed us about all these threats. You told us about these alarming case studies. You know, who do I call? If it's at that level of concern, you should still call law enforcement, whether it's the FBI tip line, whether it's local law enforcement. But as far as building the capacity and really setting up the long game for this type of work, building the capacity of local service providers to handle interventions on their own, that's where we need to continue to work together. There are currently national organizations that exist for community support. Parents for Peace is an organization, for example, which was founded by a father whose son committed a violent extremist act, I believe, in Arkansas. And they take referrals and they have experience in speaking with concerned parents. Life After Hate, that's one of our grantees. These are some former violent extremists, former extremists who have left the movement after several years. They've developed their own clinical expertise and they serve as credible voices to be able to take referrals also. They're at the national level, these types of organizations, but there are local organizations and connections that can exist as well too. Threat management programs. Cindy and I are working locally to try to identify organizations where threat assessment and threat management can be expanded, where different networks can be helpful. And then you've got the personal names and you'll have our contact info afterwards of Michael and Cindy here as well. There's a couple more slides just to close with right here as we talk about what DHS and DOJ are working on. I do see a question. I'm happy to take the question right now if it's about something that I just referred to, but it could be answered in the slides ahead. But Christina, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Commissioner Griffin-Jones, she, her pronouns. I wanted to know how many groups, hate groups in San Diego you all have monitored, and how many of those hate groups are white?
Thank you for your question. My office does not monitor hate groups at all. Cindy, over to you with DOJ.
The FBI and intelligence teams at our Law Enforcement Coordination Center do monitor those groups and complete threat assessments for law enforcement. I don't have specific numbers for you. I know that in the last threat assessment I saw, they were concerned about an increase in white supremacist organizations in Southern California in general. And I don't have specific numbers on that.
Okay. If I wanted to give you a list of those white supremacist groups, well, do you all, because a thing that's really sticking out a lot for me is that, especially when we were referring to the January 6th incident, and I guess this is also maybe some feedback for the presentation, I do think it's really important to show the faces of the folks or the hands or whatever, because it was an incident with a whole lot of white folks a part of it. And I think a lot in this presentation I definitely want to really encourage you all to really like lift up even more, talking about like white supremacy and whiteness and the privilege that whiteness gives folks to be able to behave in the ways that they behave, right? A lot of these stories or these case studies, I know Black children who have done less and are incarcerated. So I think that the role that racism plays, because it's like, DHS and we're counting on other law enforcement. Basically, we all know we on stolen land. I, as a descendant of slaves, I am a stolen person on stolen land. So, I mean, it's like white supremacy built upon itself. So it's important that if we are making any attempt to disrupt the violence, that the very white violence that's happening in this radicalization, I mean, being more upfront about that, because me and I know that other non-white folks can relate. I learned that I was different and I was Black when I was in preschool, right? Like I knew that there was a world where I would have to be small and be quiet and be good when I was in preschool. These folks these white cisgender men who are harming people, I see a lot to be like, hey, make sure to check on him if he's doing this, that, and the third. But I'm concerned because it's like, do we need to teach folks in preschool, like, this isn't what you do. And then like one last thing, and I'll go back on mute. Well, it's okay. I think I forgot that last thing, but yeah, that's definitely my feedback.
Deeply appreciate your feedback. My name is Michael Brown, and I know that name has resonance since Ferguson, Missouri, and I'm hearing you 100%. I think your feedback is well taken. I'll be happy to bring that back to our folks as we roll this out nationally, because your voice is critical to this discussion, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with you on that.
I'm sorry, Michael. I remembered. Earlier, you also talked about the real mental health component, and again, I have to apply, look at that with a scope of using race, right? Like when our Asian loved ones were killed in Georgia, that police chief got on and said he was just having a bad day. In my community, COVID-19 has hit. Black folks in San Diego have lost jobs, have gotten COVID, have buried folks, and we were burying folks, because of being killed by police, and that type of bad day. Okay.
You know what? I hear
me now.
Okay.
I just said.
Oh no, you're back. You just came back.
What part did I cut off?
You were talking about the police chief and how he made the ill-appropriate comment on having a bad day. You were talking about your community with the AAPI.
Right.
Yeah, Black people are not allowed a bad day in this world because we have so many instances, and data shows, right, that folks with disabled Black people and disabled people are at a higher rate of being killed by police, So I think with my feedback kind of in a ball, I think it is really important that we talk about the danger of white supremacy. We talk about the roots of that, and also just being really careful and being very open with the way that our our country that is obsessed with white supremacy and loves it and centers it, how it makes excuses for white cis men, and it incarcerates people who are not white cis men.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me speak again.
Oh, no, absolutely. Thank you for your input. I think I have a lot of thoughts for proposed courses of action. As Cindy and I are embarking upon developing this prevention network, that's one element. It might be beneficial. I've worked for the Department of Homeland Security now coming on 14 years this summer. So there might be other elements within the department where I could work with you to set up a briefing with a more expanded familiarity of the violent white supremacy threat. And we all know it, we're all living it, we're all seeing it. But I mean, as far as an element that where a researcher can actually talk to you about how we see it in that regard. And I think that'll be helpful because, you know, we want to work with you. We want to move forward on prevention and spend the time talking about the options for solution. And I wanted to make sure that our presentation today, while addressing the threat piece, also focuses on this prevention model. So I think your feedback is excellent. Deeply, deeply appreciative. Cindy, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we close up on the remaining slides?
Sorry,
No,
normally
I was
had
just
her hand
reiterating
up
what
too.
Michael said. Thank you.
I'm sorry,
Commissioner
Christine.
Chavez. Sorry,
Oh, okay.
Commissioner Chavez Peterson had.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to finish your presentation. I'm actually going to have to leave the meeting earlier. I want to thank you for your presentation. And the reason I asked the question about whether or not it was funded from the same program is because when the program was launched, I'm sure you all are aware, there was a lot of concerns about the specific targeting of the Muslim community from the earlier versions of this program. And so, I mean, I am, you know, I don't obviously don't support any type of extremism at all. But I do think that there's I was kind of heartened to hear you specifically name white supremacy or some of the white nationalists and what happened on January 6th, because in previous, you know, erudition, like versions of this program, it has been kind of explicitly focused on the Muslim community, and that's created a lot of programs. I think it was in 2018 in LA, community organizations like Asians Advancing Justice, ACLU, CARE, and many, many others really organized to stop a $500,000 grant coming from the federal government to the local city because of the concerns. So I am all for figuring out how we make sure we keep our community safe. And, you know, as a mother of several children, but my youngest being 12 and almost 13, I'm also well aware of what's happening in our communities in terms of, you know, just the rise of hate and division and polarization. So there's definitely work to be done. I will say that, you know, Department of Homeland Security kind of as an entity still has a lot of work to do to rebuild trust, especially in communities of color, whether it's the Muslim community, the immigrant community, et cetera. So thanks for this, but I am curious a little bit more about kind of the details, but we can get, it sounds like you guys are just revamping this. And we do have a staff attorney out of our LA office who focuses on this and who sued Department of Homeland Security because of the targeting of the Muslim folks. So just open to continued conversation.
I deeply appreciate your input. As I said, I've worked with this team of folks now for the last 4 or 5 years, and I am hearing you 1,000,000%. I recognize some of the perceptions, intentions from the community perspective here in Southern California long before I got here. That's kind of why I opened my presentation saying, you know, violent extremists in Spain killed my dad, right? Like, I'll throw that right out there on my sleeve and just say, we want to stop all the violence. And if we can find a way that finds the right method of developing prevention programming so capacity can be built for local organizations to support interventions on their own, we're going to win together as Americans, as a society, as San Diegans. I'll go out there and say this. I think we could have done a better job 4 years ago. You know, I don't know if you get DHS or federal officials saying that type of stuff, but I want to be real with you guys too. Like, I really know that the intentions were positive. I think we all want the violence to stop, but the methods were misunderstood. And I think that there's a great team of folks, and I'm proud to be a part of that team, and I'm proud to work for the department. And I really, really look forward to working with you. I'm in Orange County, so I'm not too far away, and I'd love to come down and meet with you face to face. Got my vaccine a couple of weeks ago. I got a double mask, whatever you want to do. Like, let's connect in person and break bread and find ways to move this forward. I think San Diego and LA are leading the country in a lot of different ways as far as identifying solutions for this type of mission, and it's really a treat to be here. Cindy, you've been here much longer than me. I'm kind of going long right here on my commentary, and I would love for us to go through our remaining slides, but I offer to you, as you know, having been here long before I showed up.
Yes, I have to say, I really do feel that all the prior concerns that were raised about the initial program, they were heard. They were really deeply heard. And I feel the agency made such a good faith attempt to respond to each and every single concern. The original program, while well-intentioned, was flawed. And DHS recognized that. And I think the threat picture has changed dramatically in this country. And, you know, the concerns are different today. And I really hope that people will look at this revamped program with an open mind and not through the lens of what the program used to be, because it is so much different now. And the focus on coming together and working together to protect all of our communities is really front and center in this program now. So thank you very much for raising that. I think it's important to get it all out on the table. And I think those concerns really have been effectively addressed by this, but we're always willing to engage in additional conversation.
Question. Tammy, would you like to add something there as well?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank you both for your presentation and to remind the Commission that today is the 2nd anniversary of the shooting of Poway Chabad, where Lori Kay was murdered and several others were shot. It was 2 years ago today. It impacted our entire community. The Jewish community has and will not be the same again after that shooting by a white supremacist. And I think it has to remind us as a commission of the importance that hate against one is hate against all, and the importance of standing together. It's just really critical. And I would also add that throughout this year of COVID, as schools have gone mostly online, ADL has a program entitled Online Radicalization of Youth and Safeguarding Schools that we've been presenting to districts around specifically white supremacy and students going down that rabbit hole of extremism on white supremacy. So happy to talk to anyone offline about being in your schools, but wanted to thank you, Michael and Cindy, for all you've been doing in this space.
Thank you for sharing that. In fact, I was going to close with that remark actually about the anniversary. And as an American, as a Jewish American, that resonates with me. But just like what happened in Pittsburgh, sadly, a violent white supremacist attacked the synagogue in Pittsburgh. I visited Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, and you're completely right. An attack against one is really an attack against all of us. So thank you for sharing. Cindy?
No, I appreciate that, Tammy, and that case is ongoing, and there's been a huge commitment on the part of all of local law enforcement in response to that case, but can never bring back the lives of those who were lost, and those who, you know, the closure to those who were injured is It's very important. And, you know, something like that has a ripple effect on the entire community, and we've all felt that. So I'm glad you mentioned your program, and we're going to add that to our list of local resources, because that's sort of the first step in our local prevention framework, is to develop what resources we already do have. Michael?
Thanks, Cindy. It looks like from Claudia that we only have about 5 minutes left or so. I'm happy to resume the rest of the presentation. Imam Taha, to your point, you're completely right. More work is needed to restore the trust, and I do hope that we have the opportunity to do so together. So thank you for your remark as well. Moving
Michael,
forward.
I know you have a few minutes. If you can get through those
Yep.
last slides, because I know that there's some questions out there. We'd like to get to them as much as we can. We just have a number of remaining agenda items. We'd also like to be sure the commission had an opportunity to weigh in. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. We deeply appreciate all the interest in the topic, and look forward to continuing this either on an individual basis or a group basis in the future. We've already talked about the whole of society engagement. You can see on the slide, we DHS are trying to speak with several organizations across sectors. And it's a pie chart with that whole of society. As far as this concept of local prevention frameworks, and I have a paper that I'm happy to share with you, Claudia, if you'd like to share with the commissioners further.
Absolutely.
It's a 2-page paper. So I realize this is a very text-heavy slide, which is why I took out my highlighter to what we're trying to get at. And we spoke about this during the presentation today. Essentially, we're looking to build those trusted partnerships, or in some cases, rebuild those trusted partnerships. We're looking to prepare folks to understand the radicalization of violence process, discuss risk factors and protective factors, as well as threat assessment and threat management teams, and show their value and identify needs where they can support different sectors. I'm the Southern California rep with DHS, but I also support folks in other states. I'm working with folks in Hawaii to build threat assessment team, for example, with the education sector. They can have their own, right? This doesn't have to be just an individual law enforcement approach. It requires that multidisciplinary approach from leaders from different sectors. And the local programs that each of you support, whether it's career centers, job placement agencies, service activities, youth programs, can be very helpful and valuable partners in this prevention framework model. We do have money on the street right now. There's a grant application that closes on May 25th. You can see in that red box on the bottom. I know I'm saying it very quickly. But it's also on development of new programs. Yes, I appreciate the statement being made earlier that one organization decided not to take money from us 5 years ago. And that served as a very valuable teaching moment for us to recognize that it's important to work with communities, and you know, we're available to provide help and technical expertise once grantees are awarded funds. These are the current list of grantees. There's 29 organizations spending $10 million. These are national across the United States. The ones in yellow are the ones that are working here in California specifically. If anybody has any questions about these programs, the website to our list is there located. I create a bulletin that I can, again, I'm happy to add many of you to my distribution list. If you'd like to just get the newest and latest information from the department, for example, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas made a public statement yesterday saying he's initiating an internal review about concerns of violent white supremacy, about violent extremism. He didn't say violent white supremacy specifically, he said violent extremism, but he initiated a review, you probably saw it in the press, of individuals working within the Department of Homeland Security. So Christina, to your point, when we talk about institutional racism, and when we talk about institutional needs for progress, I think that the Secretary of Homeland Security's statement yesterday sent a resounding notification to personnel that we all need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. So again, when you mentioned your comments earlier, they resonate with me very personally. As far as the Department of Justice efforts, I'll turn it over to Cindy to close.
Can you skip to 50, Michael, given that we're kind of low on time? I'm just going to float through this pretty quickly. Okay. All right, so.
Is it this one? Oh, this one.
No, sorry, the one with the,
yep.
Yes, that's it. Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right, so our goal really is to work with all of you, with our community partners, and to establish a San Diego Resiliency Collaborative And that collaboration will, we hope, bring multiple stakeholders together to address not just current threats, but those underlying issues, so that we're not just engaging in threat assessment, but threat management. And that will lead to a healthier, more resilient community. So, raising awareness by giving this presentation to any audience that's interested, bystander recognition, bystander action, leading to some sort of assessment of threat and management of threat to the betterment of everyone involved, and hopefully not resulting in violence, preventing violence, and working together to do that. I mean, that's really our goal. Next slide. So there are just a few programs that we already have in place in San Diego that are helpful towards this effort. So we have examples of people coming together already to work together on the Hate Crimes Coalition, which so many of you present are already involved with. The red flag law, we have gun violence restraining orders where there are some warning signs, and the city attorney has been very actively involved in starting a program to ensure that people who do show indicators that action is taken and we're removing guns from those people. The County Services Hotline, they did receive grant funds in 211 and have special training to provide resources to recognize some of these issues and indicators and ensure that mental health resources are provided. We have this wonderful PERT team here in San Diego that works with law enforcement, and there was recently a webinar with PERT and how they work with the Law Enforcement Coordination Center to take action and to assess threats and provide some at least initial guidance and help to people. There may be some gaps that we need to address with regard to providing ongoing services to folks over time, but they are taking some huge steps in at least starting that process. Summer Stefan was very involved, our DA, in putting together the school threat reporting protocol, which ensures that classmates who notice indicators or see perhaps threats on social media, who have an idea that somebody may be preparing to engage in a school shooting. It's a very far-ranging protocol that's been used as a model nationally. And we have a group called San Diego InfraGuard that works very closely with all of the infrastructure folks, from utilities to businesses to churches. And they work to provide programs like protecting houses of worship, making sure that people know about grants that are available to protect houses of worship. So we already have a little bit of infrastructure in place, right? And we just need to build on that and collaborate further. And I think that Michael wanted to mention a little bit about some of the services on the right side.
I think I've said a lot about it during the meeting. Just in general, you all are leaders in the community, and we look forward to working with you to identify opportunities for connection with local violence prevention programs that may already exist, mental health services, and I'm available to provide resources to you as well. The following slide has our contact information, and please feel free to reach out to us individually, work together so we can coordinate. And it would be wonderful to add you to our distribution list of information, but also, as I said, genuinely just to meet in person and get to know you and see where we can be most helpful as part of this community approach. Thank you so much for your time. We'll turn it over to Claudia to moderate or to end from here.
Thank you, Michael and Cindy. I want to thank you both so much for taking the time and going over this. The Human Relations Commission has had a series of presentations, and this really helps identify potential areas of how the Human Relations Commission can make a difference in its work and to help combat local acts of violence. So we do have a couple hands raised. We had Michael Corey and Eleanor Evans with some questions. Member Corey and then Member Evans.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. However, I would really underline, and I would like you to pass the same message, underline the word trust. It seems you in general, either I represent the Arab American community, and we were a target for you a few years ago. And then you followed, of course, as the Muslim community to become another target for you. And now you are going after while during the period when you were targeting us, those white supremacists were existing, they were available, and they were not targeted. The only time you started targeting them is after January the 6th. And then if you look at it again, you never went up to the level of who was giving them the support at the government level, i.e. DHS and above, from legislative people as well as from the administration. And that is going to become really, and that's where we look at that trust which has been completely removed between us and you as well as the leadership. And I don't know how that can be regained. And you have lots of work to be able to try to regain it for all of us.
Thank you, sir.
We had member Evans who had her hand raised.
Hello, hi. This was extremely informative and thank you so much for the presentation. However, I have, I guess, some basic concerns. Like in one of your presentations, you talked about that less educated folks were more liable and probably so to be persuaded to join terrorist groups. But the media, at least since January the 6th, has constantly broadcasting that how well educated the participants were on January the 6th. Mm. And they bring that out a lot. And I think we need to kind of, to say less educated, I think it's a little bit more of a stereotype. I think that kind of attitude, that terrorist attitude, I think it permeates every socioeconomic level. There's a book out called Race, How the Wealthy Stay Rich. And it talks about the fact that so many of these very wealthy, actually billionaires, both Bill Gates and the Koch brothers, both donate to this organization that basically is involved with the privatization of schools, voucher systems, charter schools, and yet both individuals or both parties are diametrically opposed to each other, at least they project that image, okay? And the other thing I kind of I need clarification on. One part of your presentation, you said that schools, the anti-bullying program are counterproductive, but at the same time, you're saying that schools are the primary institute for preventing terrorism and for, teaching trust and compatibility. Can I get, I really need clarification, because you're saying that, or maybe I misunderstood. Okay, the schools have the responsibility to identify potential terrorists, which I absolutely agree. But again, since I was very much involved with the anti-bullying program,
we absolutely
nationwide for the schools.
I don't know what was mentioned, but to be explicitly clear, anti-bullying programs are key, valuable members of local prevention frameworks. If I inserted a not in there inadvertently, that would have been incorrect. But anti-bullying programs are very, very central to supporting the development of upstream prevention.
In the primary tier, I think it was stated, or as I said, I may have misheard.
No, that's okay. I want to go back to my notes and make sure, Ms. Evans, that I have that correctly.
Okay. In the primary tier, I think it was discussed that that groups it formed groups, and that you were some groups were being singled out. Or maybe the way it was stated, it appeared that you were saying that anti-bullying programs singled out individuals which created or generated greater terrorists.
Oh, I think it was just, I have my notes right here, and I'm happy to share what our note is. Most school districts have policies to stop bullying behavior. The bullying behavior could lead to social isolation and alienation. However, not the programs to stop the bullying. So if that came out because I was reading a little quickly, my apologies. Anti-bullying programs are phenomenal partners in this effort. So pardon any miscommunication on my part.
Thank you. As I said, must have misheard. I was listening too hard. Okay. And the other thing was that you mentioned, I think the last slide before the questions was that talked about different groups coming together to be able to identify and help in reducing the anti-terrorists. You said administrators, faith-based groups, and some other groups like psychologists. I know especially the faith-based group. And it's my own perception, my own interpretation, but I find that people don't go to church anymore, you know? And when you lump all those groups together, how do you build trust so they will interact, so they will work together? That was the other thing, because was such a dichotomy of different groups.
I think we all know that that's not something that I can do with a briefing in a short time frame, and it takes a long-term investment. I think that's a big challenge for faith-based organizations. It's a big problem for civic organizations too. Building trust is something that takes forever to build, but can, disappear in a second. So it takes that long-term investment in the relationship building. And I as far as how to increase participation in the faith-based community, I'd be a better listener than a speaker on that topic.
Yeah, I understand. Cooperation, among those different groups is challenging.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to, we're coming up to our closing time at noon, and we still have a few items on the agenda that we need to get to. In fact, we need to decide on how to proceed with those agenda items. So I just wanted to thank Michael and Cindy for this incredible presentation. It was worth us extending our agenda, definitely. And we definitely will be creating some strategic planning action items around some of the issues that you've raised in the presentation, particularly around ways that community members can become more aware of some of the behaviors and that you have just identified. So again, thank you for your awesome presentation. And at this time, it's almost noon. Commissioner members, if we could have about 5 more minutes of your time, and then we'll go ahead and close out. Claudia, can you talk about the agenda items that we're going to have to delay on until our next meeting?
So Madam Chair, we have 3 items remaining on our agenda. The first is strategic planning, where we provided options for the Commission's consideration. I raised that only because we do not have another Commission meeting until May 25th. And the other 2 items we have delay. We can delay the strategic planning, or we could try to do it in 30 seconds or less. We also have the statements by the Commission that the Chair has brought forward as drafts for Commission consideration. The Commission could, Madam Chair, you could, a possible way to address that is, as the Chair, you have the ability, you're the spokesperson for the Commission, and the Commission can delegate to you the authority to issue the statements within the certain parameters. You can establish a subcommittee, so you could have noticed meetings to finalize any of those proposed statements, the 2 that were provided, and obtain input, public input. And we have the last item, which is to recognize Arab American Month and staff's report to indicate we will be calendaring Heritage Months. All 3 items can be rolled over to the next meeting, unless we like to try and get at least to one of those in a minute, in the next few minutes. Your pleasure, Madam Chair.
I would love to get, because of the Arab American Month, I would love to get our Commissioner Corey to share with us, particularly on that particular piece. On the statements that I have shared, we can actually go ahead and roll those over into the next meeting. We're up and running. We're still newbies at this, and so we're still trying to play catch up. So some of these items will become much more timely, but we are still in our catch-up mode. But I really would like to have Commissioner Corey to share comments regarding this most important Heritage Month.
Thank you,
Commissioner
Madam.
Corey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We will roll over items 7 and 8 then until our next meeting.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Member Corey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is Commissioner Corey. For over a century, the Arab Americans have made numerous contributions to virtually every aspect of American society, in medicine, in law, in business, education, technology, government, military service, and culture. A most recent example was the contribution made by the Palestinian American engineer Lu'ay al-Basyouni, who was originally from Gaza, who was instrumental in designing the NASA helicopter that just flew last week on Mars. As a result, Arab Americans' contributions have helped build a better nation. The State Department, many US states, counties, and cities, including in Southern California, the cities of San Diego, Los Angeles, Anaheim, Fullerton, among many others, have issued resolutions and proclamations declaring April as Arab American Heritage Month. I would like, if possible, that the HRC agree to send a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to follow suit and declare April as the Arab American Heritage Month, as well as to ask staff, Claudia and others, to develop a calendar that will go ahead for the whole year and that will identify and show the different months dedicated to the different communities within our county, such as the Black American Heritage Month, the Asian Pacific and Islanders American Heritage Month, the Jewish American Heritage Month, etc., etc. Thank you.
If that's a motion, I'd like to second it.
Thank you.
And I also would like to maybe contribute some of the other ethnic groups to that month, to those months.
We did have a hand raised. Member Murray Ramirez raised her hand, and then I'd like to get clarification on what that motion was after the discussion.
Are you asking me for the motion?
Ms. Nicole.
Okay, so
yeah, no, I was just going to make the motion that I believe has already been made to support sending that to the board.
So for clarification,
So the motion, yeah, so the motion's already been made, I gather.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I just want to get,
thank you.
if I could, for the record, get some clarification on what that motion was from Member Corey. It was to seek a request that April be declared Arab American Heritage Month, be recognized as that through a proclamation or other type of recognition.
A proclamation by the Board of Supervisors, as well as the second part of that is to ask the staff, including you, Claudia, to take care of preparing the annual calendar that shows the different months for each community.
Okay. And that was your motion, and it was seconded by Member Evans, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
Given it, because it is April 27th, you were looking for this year or for the following year, and to put that onto a cycle, just for, we can use our best efforts to put something together and seek something out as soon as we can.
I can send you what I use with the school system in about half an hour or so. And then maybe that could be a guideline.
Yeah, if I could have the language that you would like in the proclamation, we will get that moved forward and requested quickly, post haste. Go through the process to do that. I just need the language. There's a motion and a second. We'll take quick roll call vote, if that's okay, Madam Chair.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Member Anaya, I don't know if he's back. Member Arton?
Aye.
Travis Peterson had to leave. Member Kate Clark? Member Cinnamon Clark? Member De Los Rios,
Aye.
Member Desert,
Aye.
Member Elliott Santos,
Aye.
Member Essa,
Aye.
Member Evans,
Aye.
Member Fowler,
Aye.
Member Gillies,
Aye.
Member Gore by Delegated Representative Nadia Binderup,
Aye.
Member Griffin Jones,
Aye.
Member Hassan,
Aye.
Member Hodges is absent, Member Corey,
Aye.
Member Murray Ramirez,
Aye.
Member Nash,
Aye.
Member Perez,
Aye.
Member Stefan,
Aye.
Member Choi.
Aye.
That motion carries with a unanimous vote. We'll go ahead, if we can get that language, we will proceed. Member Murray Ramirez, is your hand, did you intend it to raise it again? I just saw a note that your hand is raised.
Yes, I did. I would just like to ask the chair that when we adjourn, that we adjourn in memory of the, since this is the anniversary of the white supremacist attack on the Jewish synagogue in Poway, that we adjourn in the memory of the young lady that was killed.
Absolutely. I was going to suggest that. Thank you. Let's just take a moment of silence in memory, and then we'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned. I'll see you in May. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.